Picture this. A woman so terrifying that when she died, her enemies literally danced in the streets. Another who commanded armies that conquered half the known world. And one who was so feared that grown men would flee at the mere mention of her name. These weren't fictional characters from Game of Thrones. These were real medieval women who wielded more power than most kings, commanded more respect than most emperors, and struck more fear into their enemies than any army. Today, we're diving into the stories of medieval queens who were so powerful, so ruthless, and so absolutely terrifying that history has tried to bury their legacies. These women didn't just rule kingdoms, they conquered empires, crushed rebellions, and redefined what it meant to be a monarch. Forget everything you think you know about medieval women being powerless. These queens made kings look like weaklings. Welcome back to Life in the Dark Ages. I'm your host, and if you're new here, we specialize in uncovering the brutal realities of medieval life that most history books skip over. Today's episode is going to blow your mind because we're talking about medieval women who wielded absolute power in a world that was supposed to keep them silent. These aren't feel-good stories about women breaking barriers. These are tales of ruthless political operators, brilliant military strategists, and absolutely terrifying rulers who dominated their enemies through sheer force of will and intelligence. We're covering 8 of the most powerful female rulers in medieval history, and trust me, by the end of this video, you'll understand why their enemies had nightmares about them. Before we dive in, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We're building an incredible community of history enthusiasts who want the real stories, not the sanitized versions. Your support helps us continue bringing you these deep dives into the Dark Ages. Our first terrifying queen is Eleanor of Aquitaine, a woman who was married to 2 kings, gave birth to 3 more, and basically controlled European politics for 7 decades. The inheritance that changed everything. Eleanor wasn't just born into power, she inherited the largest duchy in France when she was just 15 years old. The Duchy of Aquitaine was massive, stretching from the Loire Valley to the Pyrenees. It was larger and richer than the domains of the King of France himself. This made Eleanor the most eligible woman in Europe, but also the most dangerous. Any man who married her would instantly become one of the most powerful lords in medieval Europe. The French marriage disaster. Eleanor's first marriage was to Louis VII of France, and it was a political disaster from day one. Louis was a pious, boring king who wanted a quiet, submissive wife. Eleanor was a vibrant, intelligent woman who wanted to rule. The marriage fell apart spectacularly during the Second Crusade. Eleanor not only went on crusade herself, which was shocking for a woman, but she also challenged Louis's military decisions and may have had an affair with her own uncle, Raymond of Antioch. When they returned to France, Eleanor demanded a divorce. In medieval times, queens didn't demand divorces, but Eleanor did, and she got one. The English Gambit. 8 weeks after her divorce, Eleanor married Henry Plantagenet, who would become Henry II of England. This wasn't just a marriage, it was a geopolitical earthquake. Eleanor's lands, combined with Henry's inheritance, created the Angevin Empire, which stretched from Scotland to the Pyrenees. They controlled more territory than the King of France, and Eleanor was the mastermind behind it all. The Rebellion of 1173. Here's where Eleanor shows her true terrifying nature. When her marriage to Henry II soured, she didn't just complain. She orchestrated a massive rebellion against him, using their own sons as her weapons. Eleanor convinced 3 of her sons, Henry the Young King, Richard the Lionheart, and Geoffrey of Brittany, to rebel against their father. This wasn't just family drama. It was a coordinated attempt to overthrow the most powerful king in Europe. The rebellion failed, and Henry II imprisoned Eleanor for 16 years. But even in prison, she continued to influence European politics through her network of allies and spies, the Regent Queen. When Henry II died and Richard the Lionheart became king, Eleanor was finally free. At age 67, when most medieval women would be long dead, Eleanor became the effective ruler of the Angevin Empire. When Richard went on the Third Crusade, Eleanor ruled England as regent. When Richard was captured, Eleanor personally raised his ransom and negotiated his release. When Richard died, Eleanor maneuvered to ensure John became king instead of Arthur of Brittany. Eleanor of Aquitaine died in 1204 at age 82, having outlived both her husbands and most of her children. She had been the most powerful woman in Europe for over half a century, and her enemies breathed a sigh of relief when she finally died. If Eleanor of Aquitaine was politically terrifying, Empress Matilda was militarily terrifying. She's the only woman in English history to seriously fight for the crown, and she nearly won. The legitimate heir. Matilda was the daughter of Henry I of England and his designated heir. When Henry died in 1135, Matilda should have become England's first queen regnant. Instead, her cousin Stephen of Blois seized the throne while Matilda was in Germany. This wasn't just a succession dispute, it was a constitutional crisis. Could a woman rule England in her own right? Stephen and his supporters said no. Matilda said yes, and she was willing to fight a civil war to prove it. The anarchy begins. The conflict between Matilda and Stephen became known as the Anarchy. 19 years of civil war that devastated England. But calling it anarchy understates Matilda's role. She wasn't just a claimant. She was a military commander who personally led armies against Stephen. Matilda had several advantages. She was legitimately the rightful heir. She had the support of powerful barons, and she was backed by her half-brother, Robert of Gloucester, one of the finest military minds of his generation. The Battle of Lincoln. In 1141, Matilda achieved what seemed impossible. She captured King Stephen in battle. At the Battle of Lincoln, Stephen was taken prisoner, and Matilda became the de facto ruler of England. For 8 months, Matilda ruled England from Westminster. She was never crowned, but she exercised royal power, issued charters, and made decisions that shaped the kingdom. She was tantalizingly close to becoming England's first queen regnant. The Westminster escape. But Matilda's harsh rule made her enemies. When Stephen's supporters besieged her in Westminster, Matilda pulled off one of the most daring escapes in medieval history. Dressed in white to blend in with the snow, Matilda escaped from Westminster Castle in the middle of winter, crossed the frozen Thames, and made her way to safety. It was the kind of dramatic escape that would make a Hollywood movie. The Empress who never quit. Even after losing London, Matilda didn't give up. She continued fighting for years, using her base in the west of England to launch attacks on Stephen's supporters. She was a military strategist who understood castle warfare, siege tactics, and the political dimensions of medieval conflict. Matilda finally agreed to a peace treaty in 1153, but not because she was defeated. She negotiated from a position of strength, ensuring that her son Henry would inherit the throne after Stephen's death. The ultimate victory. In 1154, Matilda's son became Henry II of England, founding the Plantagenet dynasty. Matilda had lost the crown for herself, but she had won it for her descendants. She had proven that a woman could fight for royal power and win. Matilda lived until 1167, long enough to see her son establish himself as one of the most powerful kings in Europe. Her enemies had tried to deny her the throne because she was a woman, but in the end she founded a dynasty that would rule England for 3 centuries. While Eleanor and Matilda were fighting for power in Western Europe, an even more terrifying queen was emerging in Scandinavia. Margaret of Denmark became so powerful that she was called the Semiramis of the North, after the legendary Assyrian queen, the Kalmar Union. Margaret didn't just rule one kingdom. She united Denmark, Norway, and Sweden under her personal rule. This was unprecedented in Scandinavian history and created the largest political entity in Northern Europe. Margaret achieved this through a combination of military conquest, political maneuvering, and sheer intimidation. She was a master of medieval realpolitik who understood that power came from controlling resources, armies, and trade routes. The regent who became queen. Margaret initially came to power as regent for her young son Olaf, who was king of both Denmark and Norway. But when Olaf died in 1387, Margaret didn't step aside. She consolidated power and became queen in her own right. This was shocking in medieval Scandinavia. Women weren't supposed to rule, but Margaret was so powerful that no one dared challenge her. She had the support of the nobility, the church, and the common people. The Swedish conquest. Margaret's greatest achievement was conquering Sweden. The Swedish nobility was divided. and Margaret exploited their divisions with surgical precision. She offered rewards to those who supported her and ruthlessly crushed those who opposed her. By 1396, Margaret controlled all three Scandinavian kingdoms. She had created a political union that lasted over a century and established Denmark as the dominant power in Northern Europe, the Iron Lady of Scandinavia. Margaret ruled with an iron fist. She centralized royal power, reduced the nobility's independence, and created a professional bureaucracy loyal to her personally. She was a modernizing ruler who transformed medieval Scandinavia. Her enemies called her tyrannical, but Margaret didn't care. She understood that in medieval politics, it was better to be feared than loved. She crushed rebellions, eliminated rivals, and maintained order through a combination of smart politics and strategic violence. The legacy of fear. Margaret died in 1412, but her legacy lived on. She had proven that a woman could not only rule, but could conquer and unify kingdoms. Her enemies had learned to fear her, and her successors tried to emulate her ruthless effectiveness. The Weir Union that Margaret created lasted until 1523, making it one of the longest-lasting political unions in European history. She had literally reshaped the map of Northern Europe through her personal ambition and political genius. Our next terrifying queen comes from the Byzantine Empire, where Theodora rose from being a circus performer to becoming one of the most powerful women in history, from prostitute to empress. Theodora's early life was scandalous even by Byzantine standards. She was born into a family of circus performers and allegedly worked as a prostitute before catching the eye of Justinian, the future emperor. This wasn't just a rags-to-riches story. It was a complete transformation of Byzantine society. Theodora's rise to power shattered every social convention of her time. The Nika riots. Theodora's most famous moment came during the Nika riots of 532, when Constantinople erupted in violence that nearly overthrew Justinian's government. As the palace burned and rebels proclaimed a new emperor, Justinian's advisors urged him to flee the city. Theodora refused to run. In one of history's most famous speeches, she declared, "Purple is the noblest color for a burial shroud." She convinced Justinian to stay and fight, personally organizing the defense of the palace. The massacre at the Hippodrome. Theodora's solution to the Nika riots was characteristically brutal. She ordered General Belisarius to trap the rebels in the Hippodrome and massacre them. An estimated 30,000 people died in a single day. This wasn't just suppressing a rebellion. It was a demonstration of absolute power. Theodora had shown that she was willing to kill tens of thousands of people to maintain her position. The legal revolutionary. Despite her ruthless methods, Theodora was also a legal reformer who improved the status of women throughout the Byzantine Empire. She passed laws protecting women from forced prostitution, allowing women to own property, and making divorce more accessible. Theodora understood that power meant more than just military force. It meant reshaping society itself. She used her position to advance women's rights while simultaneously demonstrating that crossing her meant death. The Monophysite controversy. Theodora also played a crucial role in religious politics. She supported the Monophysite sect of Christianity, which put her at odds with the Orthodox Church hierarchy. But Theodora didn't back down. She used her power to protect Monophysite believers and clergy. This wasn't just religious tolerance. It was a demonstration that Theodora could challenge even the church when it suited her political purposes. The Empress who redefined power. Theodora died in 548, but her impact on Byzantine history was permanent. She had shown that a woman from the lowest social class could rise to the highest position in the empire and wield power more effectively than most men. Her enemies had tried to use her humble origins against her, but Theodora turned her background into a strength. She understood the common people better than aristocratic rulers, and she used that understanding to build a power base that couldn't be shaken. In the 13th century France, Queen Blanche of Castile became regent for her young son Louis IX and proved that she was more ruthless than most kings. The Regency crisis. When Louis VIII died in 1226, his son Louis IX was only 12 years old. By law, Queen Blanche became regent, but the French nobility saw this as an opportunity to reduce royal power. What they didn't expect was that Blanche was a political genius who understood medieval power dynamics better than they did. She wasn't just going to be a caretaker. She was going to expand royal authority. The Rebellion of 1228. The French nobles quickly learned that Blanche was not to be underestimated. When they rebelled in 1228, thinking they could easily overthrow a woman regent, Blanche responded with devastating efficiency. She raised armies, formed alliances, and systematically crushed the rebellion. But she didn't just defeat her enemies, she humiliated them, forcing them to submit publicly and beg for forgiveness. The master of medieval politics. Blanche understood that medieval politics was about more than just military force. She used marriage alliances, economic pressure, and psychological warfare to maintain her position. When nobles challenged her authority, Blanche would often respond by threatening their economic interests or their family members. She was a master of finding each enemy's weakness and exploiting it ruthlessly. The crusade against the Albigensians. Blanche also played a crucial role in the Albigensian Crusade, the brutal campaign against the Cathar heretics in southern France. She used religious warfare as a tool of political consolidation, expanding royal authority while claiming to serve God. This wasn't just religious persecution. It was a calculated strategy to bring the independent-minded southern French nobles under royal control. Blanche used the crusade to eliminate political rivals while seizing their lands for the crown. The eternal regent. Even after Louis IX came of age, Blanche continued to wield enormous influence. She served as regent again when Louis went on crusade, and she remained his most trusted advisor throughout his reign. Blanche had transformed the French monarchy from a weak, feudal institution into a centralized, absolute monarchy. She laid the groundwork for the power that would make France the dominant European power for centuries. The Queen who never stepped down. Blanche died in 1252, having wielded power for over 25 years. She had proven that a woman could be a more effective ruler than most men, and her enemies had learned to fear her political genius. Her son Louis IX became a saint, but it was Blanche who made his sainthood possible by giving him a strong, unified kingdom to rule. She was the power behind the throne who never needed to sit on it herself. Our next terrifying queen is Isabella of France, who earned the nickname the She-Wolf by overthrowing her own husband and ruling England through fear and manipulation. The loveless marriage. Isabella was married to Edward II of England in 1308, but the marriage was a disaster from the beginning. Edward was more interested in his male favorites than in his wife, and Isabella was humiliated by his public rejection. But Isabella wasn't just a scorned wife. She was a French princess who understood power and knew how to use it. She began building a network of allies and waiting for her opportunity for revenge. The Gaveston crisis. Edward II's relationship with Piers. Gaveston, his alleged lover, created a political crisis that Isabella exploited brilliantly. She positioned herself as the wronged wife while secretly building alliances with the nobles who opposed Gaveston. When Gaveston was murdered by rebellious nobles in 1312, Isabella publicly mourned while privately celebrating. She had eliminated her rival without getting her hands dirty. The Despencer War. Edward II's next favorite was Hugh Despencer the Younger, who became even more powerful and hated than Gaveston. Isabella again played the long game, waiting for the right moment to strike. In 1325, Isabella was sent to France to negotiate with her brother, Charles IV. But instead of returning to England, she began organizing an invasion force to overthrow her own husband. The invasion of 1326. Isabella's invasion of England was a masterpiece of political warfare. She had built a coalition of English exiles, foreign mercenaries, and domestic rebels who were united in their hatred of Edward II and the Despensers. The invasion was swift and devastating. Edward II's support collapsed almost immediately, and Isabella's forces captured London without a fight. The king who had humiliated her was now at her mercy. The deposition of a king. Isabella didn't just defeat Edward II, she humiliated him completely. She forced him to abdicate in favor of their young son, Edward III, and had him imprisoned in Berkeley Castle. In 1327, Edward II died in captivity under mysterious circumstances. Officially, he died of natural causes, but rumors spread that he had been murdered on Isabella's orders. Whether true or not, the rumors enhanced Isabella's reputation for ruthlessness. The queen who ruled through fear. For 4 years, Isabella ruled England as regent for her young son. She used her power to reward her supporters and punish her enemies, creating a reign of terror that made her the most feared woman in Europe. Isabella's downfall came in 1330 when her son Edward III staged a coup against her. But even in defeat, she had proven that a woman could overthrow a king and rule a kingdom through sheer force of will. The legacy of the she-wolf. Isabella lived until 1358, long enough to see her son become one of England's greatest kings. Her enemies called her a she-wolf, but Isabella wore the nickname proudly. She had proven that women could be just as ruthless as men when it came to medieval politics. Our final terrifying queen is Margaret of Anjou, who fought in the Wars of the Roses and proved that women could be just as effective as men on medieval battlefields. The Lancastrian champion, Eleanor. Margaret was married to Henry VI of England, but her husband was weak, ineffective, and possibly mentally ill. When civil war broke out between the houses of Lancaster and York, Margaret became the real leader of the Lancastrian cause. This wasn't just political maneuvering. Margaret personally led armies, planned military campaigns, and fought battles. She was a warrior queen in the truest sense. The Battle of Wakefield. Margaret's greatest triumph came at the Battle of Wakefield in 1460, where she defeated and killed Richard, Duke of York, the leader of the Yorkist cause. But Margaret didn't just win the battle, she orchestrated one of medieval history's most brutal displays of revenge. After the battle, Margaret ordered that York's head be cut off and displayed on the gates of York City, wearing a paper crown in mockery of his royal ambitions. She had sent a message that crossing her meant death and humiliation. The warrior queen. Margaret didn't just command armies. She fought alongside them. Contemporary accounts describe her personally leading charges, rallying troops, and showing the kind of physical courage that was rare even among male commanders. She understood that in medieval warfare, leadership meant being visible on the battlefield. Her soldiers followed her because they saw her sharing their dangers and risks. The French alliance. When the Lancastrian cause seemed hopeless, Margaret made a deal with Louis XI of France, trading English territory for French military support. This was controversial, but Margaret understood that survival meant being willing to make unpopular choices. She returned to England in 1471 with a French army, but her timing was poor. The Yorkists had consolidated their power, and Margaret's forces were defeated at the Battle of Tewkesbury. The final defeat. At Tewkesbury, Margaret's son Edward was killed, ending the Lancastrian line. Margaret herself was captured and imprisoned, her 30-year struggle for power finally over. But even in defeat, Margaret had proven that a woman could lead armies, win battles, and inspire loyalty. Her enemies had learned to fear her military genius and her absolute refusal to surrender. The queen who never surrendered. Margaret died in France in 1482, never having given up her claim to the English throne. She had fought for over 3 decades, won and lost multiple battles, and proven that women could be just as effective as men in medieval warfare. Her enemies called her ruthless, but Margaret understood that in the Wars of the Roses, mercy was a luxury she couldn't afford. She had fought for her son's inheritance with the same determination that any father would have shown. So there you have it. 8 medieval queens who were so powerful, so ruthless, and so absolutely terrifying that their enemies had nightmares about them. These women didn't just break barriers, they shattered them completely. They proved that in the brutal world of medieval politics, intelligence, determination, and strategic thinking mattered more than gender. Eleanor of Aquitaine controlled European politics for 7 decades. Empress Matilda fought a civil war for the English crown. Margaret of Denmark united 3 kingdoms. Empress Theodora massacred 30,000 rebels in a single day. Queen Blanche crushed rebellions and expanded royal power. Isabella of France overthrew her own husband, and Margaret of Anjou led armies into battle. These queens succeeded in a world that was designed to keep women powerless. They did it through intelligence, political skill, military genius, and when necessary, absolute ruthlessness. The next time someone tells you that medieval women were powerless, remind them of these queens. They weren't just powerful, they were more terrifying than most kings, more effective than most generals, and more politically astute than most statesmen. These women didn't just rule kingdoms. They conquered empires, changed history, and proved that power has no gender. Thanks for joining me on this journey through medieval history's most terrifying queens. If you enjoyed this deep dive, make sure to subscribe and check out our other videos on medieval rulers and politics. Next week, we'll be exploring the brutal reality of medieval warfare and how it really worked. Until then, keep exploring the Dark Ages. And remember, the women were just as dangerous as the men.